Are you like me and wondered to yourself more than a few times, how many religions am I going to hell in? Well, I got so curious about this that I decided to look into it pretty deeply. Over the last month, I interviewed scholars and educators in the field of religious studies to find out what hell is like in 5 major world religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. We also discussed how a person could end up in hell so that I could determine just how many hells I'm going to. So if you'd like to answer that question for yourself, or you'd for some reason like to try to go to hell in every religion, then this video is for you. We'll start off with Christianity. For this, I interviewed one of the most recognizable scholars of religion in the world, Dr. Bart Ehrman. If anyone knows this subject, it's definitely him. Okay, Dr. Ehrman, thank you for joining me. If I was to go to hell, what would I expect to find there? What does the Christian hell look like? Paint me a picture.
Yeah, it completely depends what kind of time period you're talking about. There are some brilliant pictures of hell. You may have noticed if you go to a lot of art galleries dealing with medieval art, the paintings of heaven are not particularly abundant or interesting, but you get lots of amazing portraits of hell, including an old tradition that we have literary evidence for back in the 5th century or so, of hell being actually kind of a beast. A monster with a wide gaping mouth and swallowing souls. So you literally get pictures like that. Most people in the ancient Christian world, from probably about the 3rd or 4th century onward, imagined that hell was a place that involved fire, where people were being tormented, often by demons and other maleficent forces, and that they had different regions, and sometimes they show people suffering differently in different regions depending on what their sins were. But there's usually a lot of fire, a lot of darkness, and a lot of blood and guts.
There's this growing idea among a lot of, I think, evangelical Christians, especially right now, that hell is just a place of separation from God. It's not some place of physical torment or anything. It's more a place of mental, psychological anguish. Is this a new idea that's spreading, or does this have some kind of connection to a tradition from the past?
I don't know where it originated. It's not the view that was propagated throughout Christianity throughout its history. Hell was always understood to be a place where human souls would go for physical torment. There would be mental anguish as well. For that reason, you're separated from God, and you realize that in fact there is a good eternity that others are enjoying, and while you're being tortured forever. And so there's both mental and physical anguish. But the idea that it's purely mental anguish, I think, I'm pretty sure it's a modern phenomenon, but I don't know when it started. I think as to why it started was because people came to think that God was not he wasn't a wicked being who was worse than the worst Nazi that ever lived, who just wanted to torture people for eternity, or to allow them to be tortured. And so the logic that developed was that people have chosen not to accept God into their lives, and so they've chosen to be apart from God, and God's going to give them their choice. Okay, you don't want to be near me? Then you'll spend eternity like that. And so it'll be a mental anguish that is based on human choice rather than physical torment based on the plan of God. And so I think for a lot of people, that's more kind of satisfying as a solution to how there could be punishment after death, because you're basically choosing it for yourself.
Okay, now if I was just dead set on getting to hell, what would I do to make sure that I pay it a visit?
Depends whom you ask. I assume you mean from a Christian point of view, and even there it depends which Christian you ask. I knew of a person, a friend of my father's, who believed that if you were not baptized in his church, you would go to hell. And he didn't mean his denomination. He meant his particular local church. And so there are people who believe that if you don't belong to their denomination, you cannot go to heaven. There are people who think that you've got to believe X, Y, Z, or you won't be able to get to heaven. And there are other people, and so even among Christians, though, there are people saying that God will save everybody, or God will save you if you're a good person, whether you've heard of Christ or not. The traditional answer to this is that you've got to be you got to believe in Christ for your salvation, and your life needs to reflect it. Otherwise, you're in danger of hell. But now there are, just about every opinion you can imagine, even among Christians.
So that traditional view, is that the most long-standing view in Christianity, that you'll go to hell unless you believe in Jesus and then have your actions reflect that?
I would say that the way that people would put it throughout most of history, starting in about the 4th century or so down to the Reformation. So from the 4th to the 16th century, they wouldn't put it like that. What they would say is you've got to be a faithful member of the church. You have to be baptized, and you need to follow the dictates of the church, and that's how you'll have eternal life. That would, of course, include believing in Jesus. But throughout most of history in the West, believing in Jesus wasn't an issue. The idea you have to believe in Jesus is something that comes about since the Enlightenment, because everybody believed in Jesus. It's just how you were raised. I mean, it's like saying, do I believe in New York City or something? Like not you believe in. If you live there, you just know it's there. And so with the Enlightenment, when people started expressing doubts, the idea you've got to believe became more prominent. But before then, it certainly was the case you had to belong to the church. And so there were worries about unbaptized babies, for example, because if they're not baptized, can't be in the church, can't have salvation. So I would say all that changed with the Enlightenment, and especially it also changed with the Protestant Reformation, of course. In the Reformation, there came a much heavier emphasis on belief rather than belonging to the church.
Okay, kids, promo time. No corporate sponsor or anything, just Dr. Ehrman releasing a brief course about virgin births and pre-Christian myth, and me promoting it in return for his massive help with my video. So in history, there were other virgin birth stories outside of Christianity, maybe predating Christianity. Did those inspire Christianity? Were they inspired by Christianity? What is this course about?
It's about that question, and so the question is, is it true that there are other traditions that have virgin births, just like or very much like that of Jesus? So if you go on the internet today, if you just go, if you just Google other virgin births in antiquity, you'll find site after site after site giving you name after name after name. Oh yeah, Hercules, born of a virgin. Romulus, born of a virgin. Plato, born of a virgin. Pythagoras, born of a virgin. Alexander the Great, born of a virgin. And they'll give you the list. And it is true that throughout Greek and Roman mythology and in Greek and Roman history, there were stories about people who were born whose father was one of the gods. A god got an immortal woman pregnant. And so I'm going to be talking about those stories and showing how interesting they are and in what ways they're similar to the stories about Jesus. But also I'm going to be asking, in any of these stories, was the woman a virgin? These sites on the internet or books, lots of books written claiming this. You need to, and so most people who say that, who write who write internet posts, or who come up with sites on the internet, or even who write books about it, most people have never actually read the ancient sources to see what they say. What they do is they repeat what everybody else says. And so, people like me who are scholars of the ancient world, we read the sources. And so I'm interested in, do the sources actually talk about anyone else being born specifically of a virgin? It's an interesting question.
All right, that I have to ask, is this some kind of anti-Christian bent that you're on here? What's the point of asking this question in the first place?
Oh, no, there's nothing anti-Christian and nothing pro-Christian about it. It's purely a historical question. It's nothing anti-Christian to say that in the historian Livy, he indicates that there are stories about Romulus's father being Mars, the god Mars, who impregnated one of the Vestal virgins. Okay, so that's interesting. What about other people? Plato's parents, Alexander the Great. I mean, so you have these other stories of gods who impregnate women. My question is any of them actually a virgin? And so, or is actually said to be a virgin by the source? And so, it's not anti-Christian at all. My view is that, that if Christians want to understand what the earliest Christians were saying about Jesus, they need to know what the context was within which they were making their claims about Jesus. Today, if you talk about Jesus being both human and divine, it's worth knowing that in the ancient world, when Christians first started saying that, they were saying that to people who already knew of people who were both human and divine. I'm not saying these people really were human and divine. I'm saying that people thought they were, so they knew they were in the sense they knew it, but they might have been wrong. So my point is that to understand early Christianity, you have to put it in its original environment, and in that environment, you get these supernatural births. And so it's a bona fide question: did the stories of other supernatural births affect the authors who talked about Jesus' supernatural birth or not? So what are the similarities? What are the differences? And are the differences significant enough to make you think actually Christians aren't getting this from someone else?
All right, if you would like to see this brief course, then click the link in the description and pinned comment. It's very inexpensive, makes a nice last-minute gift to any history or religion nerd, and buying it does support my channel. Thanks for checking it out, and thank you to Dr. Ehrman for making this video possible. All right, back on topic. Now, am I going to hell in Christianity? Yeah. Yeah, I would say probably so. I mean, I'm an apostate from Christianity, so yes. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe in the supernatural at all. I don't belong to any church. I don't follow the teachings of any particular Christian body or leadership. So yeah, I think I'm damned for sure. Now, let's discuss Hinduism and Buddhism. For both of these, I interviewed Dr. Natasha Michaels, a professor at Texas State University who specializes in Asian religious traditions. She wrote a really incredible video about Buddhist hells for the channel Religion for Breakfast a while back, so I saw that, loved it, and I had to have her on to discuss. So, if you were to paint a picture of what Hindu hell looks like, what would that be? What am I seeing, smelling, hearing in Hindu hell?
Yeah. We actually don't have a lot of texts that describe Hindu hell that are, well, we might say canonical. The Vedas and Upanishads don't talk a lot about Hindu hell. We find it really in epic literature, in like Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Especially in the Mahabharata, there's a final episode where the Pandava brothers, who are the heroes of the Mahabharata, go to hell. Or they all go to hell except Yudhishthira, and he has to go save them. What's really interesting when we look there is that the hell of Hinduism is dark. There's not all the kind of gore that we would usually expect in hell is actually very much kind of, he can't see that, he can sense it around him, and he can smell it. They talk a lot about the smell being really pungent there. What's interesting there is that the whole thing is about, is Yudhishthira going to leave his family in hell? Because he explains how they all deserve to be there, and in the end, he does not.
So, upon arrival to hell, you might hear things around you, you might smell things around you, you feel things around you, but you're not going to actually see anything. It's kind of like this just idea of like complete darkness.
In the Mahabharata and other literature we have about Hinduism, there is a lot more painting around hell. King Yama is said to be the king of hell. He was one of the first two people ever created in the sort of Hindu imagination. And he actually gets used a lot. There's a really great movie called Yamadonga, which is a contemporary Bollywood movie all about Yama and his family. And he gets used a lot in contemporary ad campaigns. Those are kind of more playful takes on Hindu hell. You'll see a lot of the traditional tortures in Hindu artwork about hell, but it doesn't take, it's not quite as much a focus as we see in other South Asian religions. Sort of painting images of hell takes a back burner, I would say, in the Hindu tradition.
What role would you say that hell plays within the wider theology of Hinduism? Is it like a place of punishment, or is it just somewhere that you go regardless? Is it purifying?
Yeah. I mean, so Hinduism is based on this idea of karma, that your rebirth is determined by actions you did in this life, but in other previous lifetimes. And so hell is a place where you go in punishment, usually to get your karma burned off so that you can be reborn in a next life. What we're going to see, like what you can see is when you look at what happens with Buddhism, which grows out of Hinduism, they really codify what or especially kind of early forms of Hinduism are sort of the idea there's other realms and that you're going to be reborn in them. And Buddhism really codifies those and says you will be reborn in one of these 6 realms. But in Hinduism, the idea is that this is a punishment for bad karma, but you're not going to be there forever, that eventually you will cycle out of it and be reborn somewhere else.
Okay, so if I want to pay a visit to the Hindu hell, what do I do? Any kind of action that I can do to make sure I get there?
Well, in kind of early Hindu contexts, where the caste system is still a very predominant form of Hinduism, you could, if you were reborn as a Dalit or an untouchable, you could touch a Brahmin or somehow infect a Brahmin with your saliva or some other part. That's going to get you a lot of bad karma. Obviously, anything involving a cow or beef, that's going to get you a lot of bad karma and ensure that you'll be reborn there in hell.
What about any actions against people who are not of a particular caste? You know, if someone is a similar caste, similar social status as me, and I do something mean to them, is that a ticket to getting bad enough karma for that?
I'm trying to think. I don't remember any texts in Hinduism off the top of my head that are kind of clear. You do this, you're going to get this bad rebirth. You do this, you'll get this bad rebirth. So it tends to be much more subliminated in that. Just you will get bad karma if you do, of course, the kind of traditional murder, lying, stealing, but nothing quite as clear as we do see in later traditions. That is very much, if you do this thing, you will 100% be born in hell in your next life, and your family has to do all sorts of things to get you out.
So are you telling me that it might be difficult to guarantee my spot?
Yes, I think that it would, especially in the Hindu tradition, be very hard to guarantee your spot.
Well, good and bad news there, I guess, depending on how you look at it. Switching over to Buddhism now, is there a similar image? I mean, literally, is there a similar image in Buddhism as Hinduism? Is it dark? I've heard that in Buddhism, apparently, you might go to hell for something like trillions of years, but it's not permanent.
Yeah, so Buddhism is borrowing all of the same ideas from Hinduism, and so you might go to hell. You will go to hell for a bad karma, and you might be born there for billions of years, but you will eventually get out, that this is just a different plane of existence, a different realm, and the cycle of suffering, or the cycle of samsara is what they call it, in both Buddhism and in Hinduism. But I will say that Buddhism took Hindu hells and really codified them and made them this rich well of tradition. Christian hells, Jewish hells have nothing on Buddhist hells. And they're a really great way to actually chart how Buddhism leaves India, because you can watch certain hells that are very canonical in both Hinduism and Buddhism. You can kind of watch how when Buddhism goes to China, suddenly that there's new hells being talked about, or when Buddhism goes to Thailand, there's new heroes that are saving you in hell. So one of my absolute favorites is called the Utpala hell. So this is a cold hell, because both Buddhism and Hinduism have cold hells. And in the Utpala hell, it gets so cold that your skin blisters, and because the blisters have liquid inside them, the liquid freezes, and because ice takes up more space than water, it actually bursts your skin open with the ice, and then it looks like you're covered in just hundreds of blue lotuses. That's probably one of my most favorite hells. It's very poetic. The art depicting it is usually a little person just covered in blue flowers, obviously in pain and in torture.
Yeah, a very different image than some of the Abrahamic hells that I've seen. It's funny to think about ice rather than fire, but can hurt just as badly, right?
Yeah, and I mean, they're usually not quite as detailed as the fire hells, When I look at Buddhist scriptures, they sort of spend more time on the fire hells, but they also just spend a lot of time on what are called the neighboring hells. In classic Buddhist literature, there's 8 cold hells, 8 hot hells, and then an infinite number of neighboring hells. And that's where you get this kind of flexibility as Buddhism moves throughout Asia to add in new hells that might be especially scary for people in China and in Japan, but not that scary for people in India.
Okay, so if I am a Buddhist and I am really trying to make that my destination, how do I get to hell?
So there is one person who in the Buddhist tradition they say is in hell forever. And this is a cousin of the Buddha that tried to kill him multiple times. And the stories are kind of funny. He gets an elephant drunk and tries to send it rampaging after the Buddha. That will get you dragged down to hell, and you'll be there forever. That's kind of your guarantee there. But different Buddhist texts will have lists of things that if you do this, you will be reborn this way. Anything that dishonors a monk or the Sangha or a Buddha statue, it's going to give you a lot of bad karma and will almost certainly ensure that you're going to be born in hell in your next life. One of my favorite hell texts is called the Blood Bowl Sutra. This is in China. It's one of these apocryphal hells, one of these hells that we don't see in India, but that is begins in China and then eventually moves into Korea and Japan. And this is a hell for women particularly, where the idea is that women bleed a lot. They bleed when they have children. They bleed once a month, and that blood is naturally polluting. And so so at some point in a woman's life, she will unintentionally pollute a holy object, like a monk, like a Buddha, like an offering. And for that, she will be taken to hell and boiled alive in vats of her own menstrual blood, along with other women. This is actually one of my favorite hells also because the sutra that describes this, the Buddhist text that talks about this, it actually became the engine by which women got a lot of social power because it says if you copy this out, you won't be reborn in this hell. And so women in China, especially in the Tang Dynasty, would get together and have tea and cookies and copy the sutra and actually began to get a lot of social power with these little sutra copying clubs. So unfortunately, my interpret from that, according to some forms of Buddhism, being a woman is pretty clearly going to get you in hell. One thing some Buddhist texts will talk about is that if you are reborn in the God realm, which is one of the 6 realms you can be reborn into, that you will be reborn in hell in your next life because you used up all of your good karma in the God realm. The God realm is this frat party that never ends. You used up all of your good karma, and all that's left is bad karma to burn off. So you immediately cycle down into the hell realm. But that's less of a hard and fast rule and more of a suggestion of what might happen.
Wow, it sounds like for those of us who are more acquainted with Abrahamic traditions, this is comparatively very complicated.
Yes, and very complicated and very rich, we might say, in academic terms, which is sort of a way to be. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of things that are very exciting in it.
Now, there's a specific hell for women, but is there a male hell, or are you being suspended by something if you are a bad boy?
Not really. Like most religions, Buddhism is what we'd say patriarchal. It is sort of, in fact, most Buddhist texts will say that a good rebirth in the human realm is a male rebirth. The rebirth as a woman is actually quite bad karma. It's a low rebirth. Men do still get tortured in hell, but nothing specifically for being men. Interesting.
Okay. Well, I guess there are some similarities between some Abrahamic traditions and Eastern.
Yes. When I teach world religions at Texas State University, I always say, unfortunately, this is a through line in most religions: is women aren't in a good place.
Huh. Well, maybe there's a hell we don't know about for those who come up with traditions that implicate and punish women for things rather than men. Who knows?
We can hope.
Are there any other interesting traditions that you'd like to bring up, things outside of Hinduism or Buddhism, or even things within them that you'd still like to discuss?
Yes. So a lot of my research is on what we might call popular literature in Tibet and China. And there's really great, in both Tibet and China, there are these great stories about people who descend to hell, and go see all of its horrors, and then come back to share their experiences. And they're actually often women that do this. And so some sociologists have looked at this and said, well, this is women's way of kind of gaining authority in their tradition. But they're really incredible pieces of literature, because what's cool is that they show this vision of hell that is not quite what we might say the Buddhist party line. They show this vision of hell that is not what the monks are teaching in the monastery, but what we might say sort of popular belief about hell. And I think that's like a really interesting place to look for what most people think about hell. I think across when I teach about hell in my world religions classes or in my religious studies classes at Texas State, a lot of students think, oh, hell's in the Bible, hell's in the Quran, hell is in these very clear places. And it usually isn't. Hell is this idea that actually usually comes about from kind of outside of other tradition, or outside of what we might say like the scripture of a religious tradition. And I think there's something really interesting there. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but that's why I researched this, so I can try and figure that out.
I love it. I think that I might have to come down and audit a class if you'll be teaching sometime in the spring.
Well, you'd be welcome to.
Okay, am I going to hell in Hinduism and Buddhism? Well, for Hinduism, yeah, I'm not completely sure, because I live in Texas. I have eaten a lot of steak, a lot of beef, cattle. Farming is a massive thing here, and I've definitely supported that industry in the past. Although now I'm vegan, so who knows? Maybe I'm not going to be weighed down by all the bad karma of all the cows I've eaten in my life. I've definitely never done anything to a Brahmin that I know of. So maybe not. I think this one might be my best chance of not going so far. Now, in Buddhism, again, yeah, maybe. I'm a guy, so I guess by nature of my sex, I'm a little less likely to go, apparently. However, I have done one thing which might have been dishonoring to a Buddha statue or temple. In Singapore, one time I went to the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple, I think it was called. I made a video there, filmed a bunch inside, and at one point in that video said that the Buddha Tooth Relic, this giant tooth that was supposed to belong to the Buddha, was almost definitely fake. It was almost definitely like a cow tooth or something. So is that disrespectful enough to land me in hell? Maybe. Although I am probably closer to Buddhist in my philosophical orientation out of any of the religions I'll cover here, so maybe not? I think this one's very ambiguous. Next up, let's talk about hell in Islam. For this, I interviewed Philip Holm of the incredible religious education channel Let's Talk Religion. I've been a fan of his channel since it was tiny, like 9,000 subscribers, I want to say. So I was very excited to speak with him. He's particularly well studied in Islam, so I just jumped at the opportunity to have him on my channel for this. Can you tell me what hell is like in Islam? What purpose does it serve? And is there a diversity of opinions about what hell is like across different sects?
So hell in Islam is a place of punishment. It's a place of torment for sinners and those who have disbelieved and sort of behaved in a way that is not pleasing to God according to the religion, you could say. The word used for hell in Islam in Arabic, the most common one, I guess, is Jahannam, which is, of course, connected to the word Gehenna, which is, I think, Hebrew originally, if I'm not mistaken. But another very common word for hell in the Quran and in Islam generally is an-nar, which literally means the fire. And so that kind of paints a picture of the general characteristics of that place, or whatever you want to call it. It's often described as a great fire where sinners are burned. The Quran contains some really vivid pictures of what this looks like. It says that sinners will be fuel for the fire in hell. Sometimes that there will be boiling water poured on the sinners and their skin will burn off. It's very nasty stuff, but it's a lot of fire metaphors, basically. Or maybe not metaphors. We'll get to that, I guess. Again, the Quran does describe hell a lot. So compared to something like Judaism, which I'm sure Justin Sledge will be talking about, In the Hebrew Bible, there isn't really a hell. There's this concept of Sheol. And hell, as we know it, really comes to be primarily, I would say, in what is known as Jewish apocalypticism, which is a movement around the turn of the Common Era. And so it does show up more so in the New Testament, this idea of divine punishment and hell, heaven and hell. But it really is in the Quran where it's like, at least to me, it's most prominent. It's like a central part of Islamic theology and the central scripture to a much larger degree. And so it's often seen as one of the 6 articles of faith, this idea of divine judgment and punishment. Sometimes they talk about different sort of layers of hell. Sometimes there are 7 layers to hell, because there are, in the Quran, they describe 7 gates to hell, for example. And the 7 layers will also often be seen as sort of mirroring the 7 heavens or the 7 levels of paradise. There's a kind of a mirroring going on there between the upper and the lower world. And Muslim scholars across history have, of course, interpreted this hell in many different ways. Is it a physical place? Is the torment there a bodily torment, or is it a kind of spiritual, psychological torment? And scholars have been very divided on those kinds of questions, as well as questions of, is hell temporary, or is it eternal? In general, you could say that many of the Muslim philosophers, for example, like Ibn Sina or Avicenna, will often interpret hell more so metaphorically. And they'll have arguments like paradise can't be a bodily paradise because the body just comes inherently with stuff that's negative, like it's a temporal and limited body. So that can't possibly be what paradise is like. And so likewise, punishment in hell probably isn't bodily either. And this is, of course, connected to another idea in Islam about the resurrection. So in Islam, there is this idea that we die and we go to this place called the Barzakh, which is a kind of place where we await the day of resurrection, almost like a limbo, as like a waiting place. And then on the day of resurrection, the world is destroyed and all the dead are raised and stand before God. And then they are given this judgment after this fact. And either they go to paradise or they go to the fire. Because that's another very divisive topic in Islamic theology and philosophy, whether or not this resurrection of the dead is a bodily resurrection or a kind of spiritual resurrection.
If I wanted to go to hell in Islam, what would I do? And is there a diversity of views on what gets a person there within Islam?
Yes, of course. Since there are different schools of Islam and different branches of Islam, they will have different ideas about who gets to go to paradise and who gets to go to the fire. Like I said earlier, Islam has this huge emphasis on accountability and judgment in general, because it is so prominent in the Quran. And in particular, Islam is very concerned that people give God what God is due, so to say. That there is one God. God has created everything. He has created us. He has given us this life, all our existence, the food we eat, the beautiful world around us. Everything is made by this God. And then people turn away from that God. They don't believe in him, or they worship other gods or something like that. And this in Islam is the greatest of all sins. Is something called shirk, which means association, basically. So associating partners with God. Some sort of translate that as polytheism. So worshiping other gods or worshiping human beings. This a sure way to get to hell in Islam is to be a polytheist, basically, is to worship another god apart from the one monotheistic God. But also that also entails, of course, following the will of that God and the laws that law has brought down. In Islam, and there's this idea that God has brought laws and religion to humankind through various prophets across history, and Muhammad, of course, is seen as the last of those prophets who brought the last law. And so currently you're supposed to believe, follow and adhere to the law of Muhammad, who represents the law of God, the Sharia as it is known, and all that includes, right? So I often argue that the Abrahamic religions are heavily ethical in nature, in a sense. They're very concerned with behavior and acting properly according to their interpretation of what is proper, of course, based on their theology. And so that means if you want to go to hell, you can, of course, go around killing people, murdering people, or lying and stealing and all these kinds of things. That will also get you to hell. So the Quran is very concerned with giving to the poor, for example, so charity, and taking care of orphans. And there's this section, the 4th chapter of the Quran, where it says, "As for those who swallow the property of the orphans unjustly, surely they only swallow fire into their bellies, and they shall enter the burning fire." So here we see a really sort of direct example of how acting unjustly towards orphans in this way. So I at least interpret this as sort of eating the food that are supposed to go to the orphans, then that sort of will come back to you as fire that will burn in your belly. And there is this idea in Islam that what punishes you in hell is not God, and that's a theological question in itself. If God, as the sort of beneficent, the merciful creator, can actually punish people, if that is a just action. In Islam, there's often the idea that what punishes you in hell is your own sins. So in the writings of Ibn Arabi, he says that the people who worship their intellects instead of worshiping God and his religion properly, it is their intellects that will punish them in the afterlife. What that means, I guess, is up for us to interpret, but that's a common idea. Basically, just sinning against the will of God, in particular, being hypocritical, not believing in God, turning away from God, not being thankful and grateful to everything that God has done. And as I said, polytheism is the surest way to that kind of punishment in Islam, because it is so concerned with this idea of monotheism, and that it is only God that is worthy of worship, and anyone who worships something other than God is committing a grave sin and deserves punishment. To some degree, if you're not Muslim, then you're kind of in trouble, because being Muslim means, literally, it means submitting to God, submitting to the monotheistic God, and following the laws of Muhammad. There are sections in the Quran where it seems to indicate maybe that the so-called people of the book, Christians and Jews and what they call Sabians, might get to enter paradise. But that verse has been interpreted in different ways. Some say that this is only referring to Christians and Jews that lived before Islam was revealed, or before the time of Muhammad, while others do leave the sort of gates of paradise open to a broader group of people. The most common opinion that I've run into is represented by Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, who does argue that in a very nuanced way, that like obviously Muslims are the ones who get to enter paradise. However, people who lived before the Prophet Muhammad obviously can't be judged because they didn't have the opportunity to become Muslim. Likewise, people who live right now, who have never encountered Islam, maybe they live on some island somewhere, they've never heard of Islam, they get a pass to some degree. And even people who live in an environment where Islam is common, but they have not been presented with Islam in a proper and fair way, they can also be forgiven, so to say. And I think that's kind of relevant today, because I think a lot of people, the way they encounter Islam is through these horrible things that are happening in the world, terrorism and all these kinds of things. And for some people, that's the only image of Islam that they have. And so to someone like Al-Ghazali, he would probably argue that those people have not been given, or Islam has not been fairly presented to them, so they at least not sort of per definition going to go to hell. So there is a lot of that kind of nuance in Islamic scholarship.
So in Islam, you could say that to go to hell, you can't be too ignorant or too adherent, but just right. It's not people who lack knowledge that go there. It's people who have some knowledge of Islam, understand it, but still choose not to follow it. Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're rejecting, like willfully rejecting the truth. And that's a great sin, of course, to Muslims.
Okay. Thank you very much for your help, Philip. I really do appreciate it. So am I going to hell in Islam? Realistically, yeah, probably. I've only ever worshipped the Christian God, so I don't know if that would count as polytheism necessarily, but I do understand Islam pretty well. I've studied it. I've visited mosques. I've read the Quran, and I still don't follow it. I reject it outright and will say right here that I think it's false. So I think that probably secures a spot for me. Yeah. Finally, let's talk Judaism. If you're a fan of the channel Esoterica like I am, then you're definitely in for a treat. I spoke to Dr. Justin Sledge, religious scholar and the creator of that channel. I've been a fan of his again since his channel was pretty tiny, so it was a real treat to have him on. So, Dr. Justin Sledge, thank you so much for joining me. Now, can you paint a picture of hell in Judaism? What's the function? What is it like? What would I expect if I went there?
So, hell, or the closest thing that we have to hell in Judaism, is called Gehenna or Gehinnom, and you can think about it a bit like a washing machine, if you want. The task isn't to punish you, but in the same way that you have to, subject clothing to punishment to get it clean, you have to subject the soul to punishment to purify it. And so hell or Gehenna in Judaism is a bit like a washing machine. The task is there to purify your soul, not so much to punish you, but you got to suffer a bit in the process. So that's kind of how Gehenna functions in Judaism. It's not a place of eternal punishment. It is a place of temporary punishment, typically only lasting 1 day shy of a year. And you even get Shabbat off for most punishments. So you get punished for 6 days, and you get Shabbat off from being punished. You actually get to roam around a little bit on the earth, and then an angel comes and brings you back, and the cycle begins again. But typically, you're not there for more than 364 days.
Honestly, that sounds kind of like a good deal compared to some of the other things I've heard so far. I wouldn't mind that quite as much. Now, is this a more modern conception? Are there older ideas of hell in Judaism?
So this is a bit of a modern conception. Now, this is also to include the idea that in Judaism, more modern Judaism, we also have the idea of reincarnation, or Gilgul, which is a different possibility of what can happen to you. But in general, Judaism, being a very old religion, has gone through several iterations of itself. People don't like to believe their religions fundamentally change, but that's what religions do because people do and societies do. So prior to the concept of hell or Gehinnom and the concept of heaven or Olam Haba, prior to that, there was a less discriminate form of the afterlife in Israelite religion called Sheol. And Sheol eventually transitioned into a sort of bilateral half-life of something like a heaven and a hell. That process happened in the Second Temple period. And we don't see a really developed concept of Gehenna until the Talmud in the Middle Ages. So, and as folks probably know, Judaism doesn't really focus much on the afterlife. It's a this world religion more than it is an other world religion. It's much more concerned about how you live your life in this world. It's much more concerned about punishments and rewards in this world as opposed to punishments and rewards in the other world. But Gehenna is a more of a Second Temple period, or what scholars will call an apocalyptic development that occurred after the Babylonian exile. So in some ways, Sheol was the dominant afterlife before the Babylonian exile, and then once the Israelites went into exile, they came back, and what they've been to develop in this apocalyptic mode was something much more recognizable as a heaven and a hell.
Very interesting. Now, if I wanted to make sure that I got a spot in hell in Judaism, then is there anything in particular that I could do to make sure that I end up there?
If you're Jewish, it's really easy. Just die die having violated the Torah without repenting. You have to go there. So no matter what it is, if you eat a pork sandwich and then die having not repented of that, if you're Jewish, you will have to go to Gehenna to have that sin purified. If you're non-Jewish, it's actually really easy to not go to hell, not to go to Gehenna. There are only 7 rules that you have to follow if you're non-Jewish, and as long as you don't violate any of those rules and you repent before you die, you'll escape Gehenna. So in many ways, it's really easy to get out of Gehenna. Just you can kind of slide into home base just at the very end by repenting right before you die. But assuming that you're Jewish and you violate a law in the Torah, you don't repent before you die, you will have to go. You have to go to Gehenna. So it's quite easy to get there. Now, depending on how bad your sin is, how much sin you have, you'll be there longer and your punishment will be worse. There's a particularly really bad part of Gehenna that you don't want to go to, that you might not ever be able to leave. There's debate about that. But that part of Gehenna is where you're, how should I say this? You're boiled in your own semen, or you're boiled in your own excrement, depending on what happens. And so that's about as colorful, it's about as Dante-esque as it gets, I suppose. But Balaam, son of Beor, the false prophet in Jewish lore, he is boiled in his own semen, according to the Talmud, forever, that he'll never be able to leave, and he gets punished on the Sabbath as well. So also there's a story where a person named Yeshu, who might be Jesus actually, he's also boiled in his own excrement forever. But there's some debate about whether that's Jesus or not. There's debate about that in the Talmud. I'm not sold either way. But typically you have to lead a whole bunch of people into things like idolatry or sexual abominations, I guess you could say. So you have to not only sin yourself, but cause a lot of other people to sin. And then you get the special reward of being boiled in your own excrement.
Wow, it sounds like you have to be a particularly bad boy to go to hell as a non-Jew. Although, if you do end up there, then you might have some very interesting company, it sounds like.
Yeah, you might be surprised who's in there. Yeah, I mean, Judaism has a difficult time with Christianity and its founder, but what's also interesting is in later Judaism, with the development of the Kabbalah, there are some people who are such sinners they don't even merit Gehenna. That is to say, they don't even merit getting to go to hell. They're so bad that hell rejects them, and they become roaming ghosts. Their souls never get to rest. And apparently being a spiritual being without being in a body is incredibly painful. It's very agonizing, according to Jewish mythology, which is very different than Christian and Islamic mythology, where your soul is actually your real self and your body is just sort of a shell that you leave behind. Judaism is a very embodied religion, so you want to be in your body. But if Gehenna rejects you, the idea is that you have to roam around, and the only way of escaping the torment of being without a body is to jump into other bodies. And these spirits that cling to other bodies are called, the word to cling in Hebrew is dabak. It's where we actually, devek is the Hebrew word for glue. And so these spirits, davak, they cling to other people, and these give rise to the legends of the Dybbuk. These are evil dead people who possess the living and ultimately kill them in most cases. So you can be so bad that you don't even get to go to Gehenna in Judaism. So you want to go to Gehenna. That means that you weren't perfect, you weren't a saint, but at least your soul's worthy of being purified. What you don't want is a situation where you have to roam around homeless spiritually, jumping from body to body, killing your hosts as like a parasite in the process.
Okay, interesting. Now, my final question for you here is, based on the fact that I, by education, I like to think, spread blasphemy through my channel, am I in danger in going to Gehenna, or even missing Gehenna altogether? I
don't think blasphemy is going to get you there. Because, I mean, assuming you're not Jewish, so it's not going to get you to Gehenna. Typically, the laws that are alleged to govern non-Jews, the so-called Noahide laws, they're really simple things like don't lie to people, don't hurt people, don't commit sexual abominations, don't have sex with the animals, don't eat an animal while it's still alive, don't hurt animals. So the laws that govern the Noahides, the 7 laws that govern non-Jews in Jewish mythology, Jewish law, are relatively hard to break. You have to be an especially morally compromised person. But there is an idea, basically, you have to believe in God. So assuming you don't believe in God, then you might have a stint in Gehenna.
Okay, well, things to look forward to, or not, depending on how you look at it. But thank you so much for joining me.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Well, it looks like my afterlife is going to be pretty bleak, although maybe a bit less than I expected, actually. But what about you, though? How many hells are you going to? If you're going to hell in every religion, I definitely want to hear about why, so drop me a comment. Thank you so much to everyone who made this video possible. Dr. Bart Ehrman, Philip Holm, Dr. Natasha Michaels, and Dr. Justin Sledge. You guys are amazing. You'll find links to their work in the description. Show them some love for helping me out here. I really can't thank them enough. With that, thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.